Good afternoon. Today we're going to finish up the section on the quadratic formula and the discriminant. I mentioned in the last video that I was going to show you what to do when the number under the square root sign turns out to be negative. We know that if the number under the square root sign, which remember we call the discriminant, when that discriminant turns out to be positive, that tells us that the graph crosses the x-axis in two places. And if the discriminant turns out to be 0, that means that the graph touches the x-axis in only one place. And the problem was, what happens when it turns out to be negative? And yesterday we said that when it turns out to be negative, that means that the graph doesn't cross the x-axis at all. And in reality, it doesn't cross the x-axis, but it does actually have two answers, but they are not real number answers like we're used to using. They are actually imaginary numbers. So today I'm going to show you how to do the translation, how to go from that expression that has a negative discriminant into the actual answer for the problem. So if you're looking at the material in our canvas, in again the section that talks about discriminant and quadratic formula, and if you go to that page and or that section and you turn to page number 7, we will look at a particular example. We may have looked at it earlier, but we're going to look at it again because now I'm going to show you what to do. So page number 7, practice number 2. I'm just trying to get to it on my screen. Practice number 2 gives us the problem 3x squared minus 2x plus 4 equals 0. And remember that we're going to use the quadratic formula, which actually, let me write that first. That way we don't have to keep rewriting it. The quadratic formula is the opposite of the b number plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So again, 3x squared minus 2x plus 4 equals 0. And again, remember that we have to have the equation equal to 0 before we can use the formula. So we're all set here. Let's write down our numbers. A is 3, B is -2, and C is 4. And we're going to plug the numbers into our equation. And again, underneath the square root sign, we're going to use parentheses, so we make sure we don't make any mistakes. Again, remember this symbol means the opposite. So we're going to take the opposite of the b number. Well, the b number is -2, so the opposite is 2. And then we just keep writing, plus or minus square root. The b number is under the square root, so it has parentheses. The b number is -2 squared minus 4. A is 3 and C is 4. All over 2 times A. And again, remember from yesterday, we can do that in our heads. 2 times the A number is 6. Now all we're going to do, if you remember from our last lesson, we're going to put this expression from that red dot to this red dot in our calculator. not the square root sign, just the numbers underneath. So we're going to get 2 plus or minus the square root. And if we do that calculation on our calculator, we should end up with the number negative 44. And this is where we left it yesterday because we had a negative square root. And today we're going to translate that into an imaginary number. The rule that we use for imaginary numbers is the square root of negative 1 is equal to I. It's a little letter that we've never used before, but we're going to say that the square root of negative 1 is going to equal that value, that I, and the I stands for imaginary. Now, if you think about it for square roots, you'll see why we need a special symbol. When you do a square root, you're looking for something that you can multiply by an identical number and end up with the number underneath. So for example, if you had the square root of 9, you want 2 identical numbers that multiply to get 9. Well, that's 3 times 3. But when you have a negative number, like negative 1, I cannot find 2 identical numbers that will multiply to get negative 1. Because if the numbers are identical, that means they have the same sign. So positive 1 times positive 1 is positive 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is also positive 1. So there's no way we can get a negative 1 if we're going to do if we're going to square a number. So that's why we need a special symbol. Well, what we're going to do here then, and we'll do it in detail first, and then you'll be able to do most of it in your head. But what you're going to do is you're going to take that negative 44, let's just rewrite it like this, and you're going to split it into negative 1 times positive 44. Because negative 1 times positive 44 is negative 44. Now, we can split that into 2 square roots. Now, some of you are probably already thinking, oh man, that's a lot of work. Well, I'm showing you the process, and you'll be able to do a lot of it in your head. So all we did was take these 2 numbers that were under the radical sign, and we gave them each their own radical. This is still over 6. Now, this is where we are. This square root of negative 1 is I. That's what that's equal to. So in place of that square root of negative 1, I'm going to put an I. Not square root, just the letter I, because that's what it's equal to. This square root of 44 stays there. Now, depending upon whether you have a scientific calculator or not, and actually because we're running out of space, I'm going to erase this top part here. Right now, we have 2 plus or minus I square root of 44 all over 6. Okay, that's where we are right now. Now, if you have a scientific calculator that will rewrite this square root as a simplified square root, then you can use it. But if you don't, here's what you do. We want to break that 44 down. And when we break it down, we want to break it down into 2 square roots. So I really want to break it down so it looks like this. One number and another number. One of those numbers has to be a perfect square. And if you remember, perfect squares are 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16. 5 times 5 is 25. Those are all perfect squares. And we want to pick one of those to go into 44. Now this list goes on, but I stopped right there because we don't need anything bigger than that right now. So you're going to pick one of these numbers to go into 44. Now, if you can't find a number, that means you're done. There's nothing else you can do with the problem. But this one I can. The number 4 goes into 44. So one of these numbers under here is 4, and the other one is 11, because 4 times 11 is 44. So you're breaking the 44 down into two numbers. One of those numbers has to be from this list, and the other number is whatever you would multiply by. Now we're going to simplify it. 2 plus or minus I, we'll rewrite it in a minute. The square root of 4 is 2. So it comes out exactly 2. So we just write it. We don't put any square root with it because it is 2. This square root of 11, we don't know. So we just leave it square root of 11. Still over 6. Now, you never see the number written after the I. You always see the I first, or I second. So this is the way you would see it if it were written down. Now, if you're going to reduce it, you cannot touch the square root. If you're going to reduce, those are the three numbers you reduce. If you're going to reduce, you have to reduce all three of them, not just two of them, but all three. Well, in this case, the number 2 goes into all three of those. So we divide everything by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1, plus or minus. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and you can put this 1 here if you want to, and then we write the rest of it. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and there is the answer to the problem. You don't need that 1 if you don't want to have it there. This one you do have to have because it's in front of the plus and minus sign, so it's part of the answer. This one you don't need. So back up when you had the negative 44, what we had to begin with, if you remember, on the top, that's what we had. So what we did was we said, okay, this negative sign is actually -1. So I can take it out of the problem and put I in its place. And that's what I did right there. I took the negative out and put the I in its place. And then what we had left was the 44. Then we broke the 44 down. And when you break it down again, one number has to be a perfect square. One number has to be from this list. The other number is what you would multiply by. So you picked a 4. Well, 4 times 11 is 44. Then that perfect square that you picked from the list, we picked it because it has an answer. The square root of 4 is 2. And that's what you want. You want as much of this number to turn into an answer as you can. You're not going to be able to get the whole thing to turn into an answer unless the original number was a perfect square. But you turn as much of it as you can. And then we reduce. And again, remember, you have to reduce all three numbers. If you can't, if you can only reduce 2 of them, then you don't do anything. You leave it alone. Okay. All right, let's try another one. Now, actually, what I'm going to do for you, so it'll be easier, and that way you'll have the same information as the kids in class did, is we're going to do a problem that's actually on one of the worksheets that you have to do. If you go in your dashboard and you scroll down to the worksheet that says Quadratic formula and discriminant worksheet number 2. The quadratic formula and discriminant worksheet number 2. If you open up that worksheet and you look at problem number 5, let's do that problem. That problem says x squared minus 10x plus 29 equals 0. And actually, if you remember this or you write down where this problem came from, then you have one of the answers on your worksheet when we're done. All right, here we go. This problem is in standard form, so we're ready to work with it. Write down the numbers. A is 1, B is negative 10, and C is 29. Plug them into the equation. The opposite of the B number is 10, plus or minus. The B number is negative 10 squared minus 4, parenthesis, the A number, parenthesis, the C number, all over 2 times the A number. Well, 2 times 1 is 2. Now we can simplify it. Again, remember, you're going to type in from this red dot to this red dot on your calculator. And if you type it in correctly, I believe you end up with negative 16. Now you'll notice that we have a negative sign underneath the square root again. When we have a negative sign underneath the square root, it's one of those what I call weird answers. And it's weird because it has an I in it. It doesn't look like all of our other answers. So this is where I said you could do stuff in your head. This negative sign really means negative 1. The square root of negative 1 is what we call I. So we take that negative sign out of there and we move it in front of the radical and change it into an I. So now that negative sign is no longer there. All you have is a 16. So I'm just going to write the 16 right now, although most of you have already figured out that that number has an answer. So then I have 10 plus or minus. We don't need to break the 16 down into 2 numbers because 16 is already a perfect square. You already know that answer. So since you already know that answer, we can just write it down. Well, the square root of 16 is 4. So we just make it a 4, no more square root, just the 4. And remember, the number goes in front of the I, so it'll look like this. Now, remember, you've got to reduce all 3 of those numbers. Well, I can divide 2 into all 3 of those numbers. So 10 divided by 2 is 5, plus or minus. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And then you can put the 1 underneath if you want, but 2 divided by 2 is 1. And since it's on the bottom, we don't need it. So this is the answer to problem number 5 on the quadratic formula and discriminant worksheet number 2. This is number 5. Okay, so there's another example of ones that have the negative under the square root sign. Okay. The last Last thing I want to do for you to make it easier is I just lost my problems. So hang on just a second here. Okay, we're back. To help you out with the quiz, because now you are ready to take the quiz on this section. Let's take a look at the quiz called the Quadratic Formula and Discriminant Quiz. Quadratic Formula and Discriminant Quiz. And let's look at problem number 6. This is number 6 on the quiz. Number 6 on the quiz is 3x squared minus 5x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, this is in standard form, so we're ready to use the formula. A is 3, B is -5, and C is 1. Again, this is question 6 on your quiz. So go ahead and plug them in. The opposite of the B number is 5, plus or minus. The B number is -5 squared minus 4. The A number is 3, and the C number is 1. All over 2 times A. Well, 2 times A is 6. Now again, plug these numbers from red dot to red dot into your calculator, and you should end up with 25 minus 12 is 13. Now, this is the kind of problem that you really want because you're done with the problem. This is not a negative number. It's a positive number. So we don't have any i's or anything, but we can't break 13 down. That list that I had up there earlier, the 1, the 4, the 9, the 16, none of those numbers go into 13. So this is the answer to problem number 6 on your quiz. Okay, let's stay on the same quiz and let's do problem number 8. Problem number 8 says 4x squared equals 8x minus 7. Again, this is question number 8 on your quiz. Now this problem is not written in standard form, so you have to move all the terms to get it equal to 0 before you could use the formula. So I have to move the 8x. It's a positive, so if I move it, I'm going to subtract it. And I have to move the -7. And because it is a subtraction, you're going to add it. Now it's in standard form. So A is 4, B is -8. C is 7. Plug it into the formula. The opposite of the B number is 8, plus or minus. The B number, -8 squared minus 4. A is 4. And C is 7. All over 2A. Well, 2 times 4 is 8. Again, from red dot to red dot. Get my calculator out here. You should end up with -48. Okay, the first thing you should notice is there's a negative sign. Since there's a negative sign, it's one of those weird answers. It's going to have an I in it. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take that negative sign. You're going to remember that that's the same as -1. And you're going to make the square root of -1, which we wrote down earlier, is I. So you're going to take that negative sign, you're going to take it out of the square root, and you're going to make it into an I. You still have the 48 there. Okay, now we're going to try to break that 48 down. We don't know the square root of 48. It's not a perfect square. So that's when we look at our list again. So let me put it over here. 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 2 is 4. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. 5 times 5 is 25. We're looking for the biggest number that will divide into 48. The biggest number, and it has to divide evenly. Well, the biggest number that will divide into 48 is 16. So I'm going to make one number 16 and the other number is 3. Why is it 3? Because 16 times 3 is 48. This first number here has to be on that list. All over 8. Now we simplify. We still have the 8. We still have the plus and minus. This square root of 16, we already know the answer to that. The square root of 16 is 4. So that 4 comes to the outside. And remember, it goes in front of the letter. This square root of 3, we don't know the answer to. So we leave it where it is. And now we look at our 3 numbers and we see if we can reduce. Well, is there a number that goes into 8, 4, and 4? Yes, there is. I can divide by 4. So 8 divided by 4 is 2, plus or minus. 4 divided by 4 is 1. You don't need to write that 1 there. I square root of 3. And on the bottom, 8 divided by 8, or 8 divided by 4 is 2. So that answer there, 2 plus or minus I square root of 3 over 2, that's the answer to question number 8 on your quiz. Now on the quiz, it actually breaks the 2 answers apart. One of them will say 2 plus I square root of 3, and the other one says 2 minus I square root of 3. So you want to pick the one that has both of those answers. Now, last problem. And actually, we did not get to this problem in the class. So if you are a face-to-face student, This is question number 9 on the quiz. Two x squared equals 1 minus x squared. No, 1 minus x. Okay. Now again, it's not equal to 0, so we have to make it equal to 0. So we're going to move this x. We'll move it first because it comes right after x squared. So that says a minus, so you're going to add. We got to move this 1. It's a positive 1, so we're going to subtract it. A is 2, B is 1, C is negative 1. Now we plug it into the problem. X equals, the opposite of the B number is negative 1, plus or minus. Now we use parentheses because we're under the radical sign. The B number is 1 squared minus 4. Now it's the A number, which is 2, and the C number, which is negative 1. All over 2 times A. Well, 2 times A is 4. Now again, from dot to dot. So negative 1 plus or minus the square root is going to end up to be a 9. All over 4. Now, you'll notice, first of all, that this does not have a negative. So since it doesn't have a negative, we're not going to have any I answers. The other thing you should notice is that you know the answer to the square root of 9. So you don't need to worry about this list over here because you know the square root of 9 is 3. So it turns out to be negative 1 plus or minus 3 all over 4. Well, you just have numbers in that problem, so you can figure out the answer. The first answer is negative 1 plus 3. Well, negative 1 plus 3 is 2 all over 4. Well, 2 over 4 reduces to 1/2. That's one answer. The other answer is when we use the subtract sign. Negative 1 minus 3. Well, negative 1 minus 3 is negative 4 over 4. And that reduces to negative 1. That is your other answer. So you would find the problem that gives you positive 1/2, negative 1 as your solution, as your roots. And that's the answer to question number 9. So now you should know how to do all the quadratics, whether the number under the radical sign turns out to be positive or negative or 0. And you can now find all of those answers. So go ahead and do the worksheets. Go ahead and do the quiz. And make sure you let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.